There are moments in history when the world seems to narrow into a single room, a single city, a single breath held by millions. In late November of 1943, that room was Tehran. Here, in a capital crowded with fear, spies, and political tension, three men whose decisions shaped half the planet were about to meet face to face for the first time. Franklin Delano Roosevelt arrived weary and determined. Winston Churchill arrived skeptical and stubborn, and Joseph Stalin arrived suspicious and guarded, carrying the paranoia of decades like a second uniform. Together, they would agree on the future of Europe, the fate of Germany, and the timing of the very operation that would one day crack the Axis in half, D-Day. But beneath these monumental plans ran a darker current, a whisper drifting through embassies and safe houses. The Germans were coming to kill them. This whispered threat, later known as Operation Long Jump, grew out of an atmosphere where espionage was not merely expected, but unavoidable. Tehran, geopolitically isolated yet strategically essential, had become a hotbed for Allied and Axis agents. Its streets were a tangle of competing loyalties. Its cafes, markets, and embassy corridors echoed with coded conversations. The city was under joint occupation by British and Soviet forces, yet this only crowded the stage further. Every power present saw every other as both an ally and a threat, and the idea that the Germans might exploit this chaos to target the Big Three felt disturbingly plausible. But truth in wartime often travels dressed as rumor, and rumors wear many disguises. Long Jump would become one of the most contested intelligence stories of the entire war, accepted by some as an aborted assassination attempt and dismissed by others as a Soviet fabrication strategically timed to serve Stalin's purposes. Soviet intelligence, particularly the NKVD, claimed it had intercepted the German plot months earlier through deep cover agents and careful interception of coded messages. According to their reports, elite German commandos trained by Otto Skorzeny were preparing to infiltrate Tehran, establish hidden bases, and strike the Allied leaders simultaneously. But as dramatic as this narrative sounds, very little of it has ever been confirmed by German archives or reliable post-war testimony. And yet, during those tense days in 1943, what mattered most was not what was true later, but what was believed in the moment. When Stalin informed Roosevelt and Churchill of the alleged plot, both men reacted according to their nature. Churchill scoffed. His first instinct was to distrust anything that emerged from Soviet intelligence unless he could verify it through British sources. Roosevelt, navigating both physical disability and political fragility, weighed the threat carefully, unwilling to dismiss Stalin's claims, yet wary of the timing. Stalin, for his part, appeared less concerned about the assassination attempt than about keeping Roosevelt physically close to him. Close enough that Churchill would be diplomatically isolated. A plot, real or invented, gave him the perfect pariah. Thus a shadow settled over the Tehran Conference. Streets were barricaded, patrols doubled, routes shifted, meetings moved. Roosevelt, who preferred to stay at the American legation, suddenly found himself housed in the Soviet embassy, linked to Stalin's residence through a secured corridor. The Americans suspected microphones in the walls. The Soviets suspected German agents disguised as local merchants. The British suspected everyone. And somewhere within this labyrinth of suspicion, the story of Long Jump was born, not only as an intelligence alert, but as a political tool, a myth-making opportunity, and possibly, just possibly, the faint echo of a real danger. The mystery of Tehran did not begin with the conference itself, but had been building for months in German intelligence circles, emerging from scattered reports about the Allied leaders' upcoming meeting. The Abwehr, struggling after repeated counterintelligence failures, was desperate for a breakthrough operation that could shift momentum back toward the Reich. The RSHA, with Reinhard Heydrich gone and Himmler eager for prestige, had its own ambitions. The Luftwaffe's foreign espionage wing had fragments of information, but no unified picture. The Nazi intelligence machine was fractured, competitive, and prone to exaggeration. Yet one thing united these rival agencies: the irresistible idea that eliminating Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in a single blow could destabilize the Allied coalition permanently. Whether this idea remained theoretical or grew into an actionable plan remains at the heart of the debate. This is the paradox of Long Jump, an operation that may never have progressed beyond sketches in a notebook still managed to shape real decisions by the most powerful men in the world. It created fear where none had existed, forced leaders into tighter quarters, and altered the choreography of the Tehran Conference. Whether born from truth, rumor, or deliberate manipulation, the threat became real the moment it changed behavior. And so, under a cold, desert sky, as guards shifted uneasily outside embassy walls and German radio operators attempted to decipher Allied movements, the story of Operation Long Jump began to take on a life far bigger than any agent or archive could contain. Even now, decades later, historians and intelligence officers continue to argue: were the Germans truly preparing to strike, or did Stalin simply seize an opportunity to tighten his grip on the fragile Allied unity while securing a propaganda victory? The answer, like most secrets of the Shadow War, lies somewhere between the darkness and the light. For the men who guided Nazi Germany's intelligence services, 1943 was a year of slipping illusions, narrowing possibilities, and desperate ambitions. The tide of the war had turned sharply against them. Stalingrad had collapsed into disaster. North Africa was lost. Italian allies were faltering, and the Allied bombing campaign hammered deeper into the Reich's industrial core with each passing month. Morale inside the German intelligence apparatus was cracked, its rival branches locked in a bitter competition for relevance. Against this backdrop, the idea of a bold, almost mythic operation, one that could reverse the fortunes of the entire conflict, proved irresistible. In Berlin, the upper tiers of the Sicherheitsdienst and the RSHA understood that Hitler had become increasingly obsessed with heroic gestures, the kind of dramatic strikes that could restore the aura of invincibility the Reich once held. Reports circulated about an upcoming Allied summit between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. No one knew where it would be held, but rumors drifted through diplomatic circles and encrypted messages. In scattered notes and intercepted communications, German analysts began to sense that a meeting of unprecedented importance was taking shape. It would be the first time all three leaders stood in the same room. It would be the moment they mapped out the invasion of Europe. And to German planners, it was the moment all three could die at once. But what existed first was not a plan. It was a fantasy, a vision of a single blow that could tear apart the uneasy alliance binding the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Remove Roosevelt, and the Americans might retreat into internal political chaos. Remove Churchill, and British resolve could falter under the weight of war weariness. Remove Stalin, and the Soviet Union might fracture or fall into a brutal succession crisis. Even if none of these outcomes fully materialized, the disruption alone would buy the Reich time to rebuild, to redeploy, to turn the war in some new direction. Debates erupted in German intelligence offices. The Abwehr, battered by failures from Norway to North Africa, felt pressure to reassert itself. Canaris, the Abwehr chief, was outwardly dutiful, yet increasingly disillusioned with Hitler's regime. Many inside his service doubted the wisdom or even the morality of such a mission. Yet their hesitation opened a door for the SS, which was eager to claim glory. Himmler's RSHA, especially the Foreign Intelligence Branch under Walter Schellenberg, saw opportunity in chaos. Schellenberg, clever and politically attuned, recognized that even the hint of such an operation could elevate his standing. And somewhere on the periphery of these bureaucratic rivalries was Otto Skorzeny, the rising commando leader whose daring rescue of Mussolini had vaulted him into the Nazi spotlight. After Gran Sasso, Skorzeny became a symbol of the Reich's last-minute miracles, a man whom propaganda framed as capable of achieving the impossible. He was charismatic, arrogant, and strategically imaginative, the perfect figure to attach to a plot as cinematic as the assassination of all three Allied leaders. Whether Skorzeny himself ever seriously prepared for long jump remains uncertain. His post-war statements alternated between boasting and denial, but his name became fused with the operation, not because he confirmed it, but because the idea of Skorzeny, the commando mastermind, made the story feel real, even to those who doubted its feasibility. German intelligence, fractured as it was, began feeding fragments of the concept through its channels. Agents in Turkey reported unusual Allied diplomatic activity. Sympathizers in neutral embassies hinted at upcoming high-level travel. Radio intercepts carried clues that the Big Three might soon meet somewhere within Soviet reach. These whispers hardened into an assumption. The Allies were planning a major summit before the end of the year. Tehran, Cairo, Baghdad, and even Yerevan emerged as possibilities. The Germans lacked clarity, but the lack of clarity only widened the imagination. If they could place a small number of elite commandos in the right city at the right moment, the damage they might inflict could be catastrophic. Yet here lies the tension at the core of Operation Long Jump. While German intelligence was indeed aware of the upcoming summit and entertained ideas of sabotage or assassination, there is no surviving document that confirms a fully developed operational order. Nothing in the Reich's archives states explicitly, dispatch teams, infiltrate Tehran, kill the Big Three. Instead, the evidence shows fragmented suggestions, conceptual proposals, exploratory memoranda, kernels of possibility rather than concrete directives. Some historians argue this absence proves the operation never existed beyond rumor. Others counter that many SS operations, especially those involving high-risk clandestine action, left minimal paperwork by design. But regardless of its official status, the idea of long jump was alive. It circulated in whispered conversations and half-serious planning meetings. It flickered in the minds of men desperate to reclaim the initiative. And as the Germans grasped for any information on the Allied summit's location, Tehran surfaced again and again. A city teeming with political intrigue, a city with divided occupation zones, porous borders, and a centuries-old culture of clandestine movement. A city where German agents still lingered from pre-war networks even after the Allies purged most Axis operatives. Tehran was not just a possibility. It was the ideal stage. The Germans' dream of a decisive strike relied on two assumptions: that they could infiltrate Tehran before the summit, and that they could act with precision once the Allied leaders arrived. Both assumptions rested on fragile foundations. At best, they possessed access to scattered assets, a few sympathetic locals, a handful of former diplomats, remnants of pre-war German businesses. At worst, they had nothing but fading names in outdated files. Yet in the eyes of Berlin's planners, even this thin network could be reactivated. All they needed was a spark, A covert arrival, a secret base, a single team capable of striking fast and vanishing just as quickly. The tragedy, or perhaps the irony, is that while the Germans dreamed of infiltration, Soviet intelligence had already saturated Tehran. NKVD agents, operating under diplomatic cover and through local networks, had turned the city into a labyrinth of surveillance. Every foreigner was tracked, every unusual movement noted, every whispered plan recorded. And it was within this environment, dense with watchers and shadows, that the first hints of the alleged German mission reached Soviet ears. Whether those hints reflected a real operation or the Soviets' own desire to craft a narrative of vigilance and heroism is a question that lingers to this day. But as 1943 drew toward winter, the idea of long jump moved from speculation into action, or at least into claims of action. For the Germans, the operation represented a last chance at strategic disruption. For the Soviets, it represented an opportunity, one they would seize with both hands as the Tehran Conference approached. And so, the story deepened. Germans imagining a desperate strike, Soviets claiming to detect it, and the Allies preparing to walk into a city where truth and fiction had already begun to blend into a... If the Germans were dreaming, the Soviets were watching. Long before Roosevelt's aircraft touched Iranian soil, the NKVD had woven itself into the fabric of Tehran, moving through the city with a confidence born from both fear and familiarity. The Soviets had occupied northern Iran since 1941, and unlike the British forces in the south, who tended to rely on diplomacy and influence, the NKVD preferred a methodical saturation of every neighborhood, market, and social space where dissent or espionage might take root. To them, Tehran was not merely a host city for a conference. It was a battlefield of shadows where even the dust carried secrets. To understand how the Soviets claimed to uncover Operation Long Jump, one must first understand the world of Soviet intelligence at this moment. Stalin demanded vigilance, but distrusted everything. His intelligence services lived inside that contradiction, compelled to produce results that demonstrated omniscience, while knowing that any failure, real or perceived, could end in a basement cell. The NKVD's greatest weapon was therefore not simply fear, but the paranoia that fueled it. To survive, they had to find threats, or create the impression of finding them. It was within this intense environment that a figure named Nikolai Kuznetsov emerged as one of the key sources tied to the long jump story. Kuznetsov, a Soviet partisan and deep cover operative working inside German-occupied Ukraine, had built a legend blending linguistic mastery, daring infiltration, and absolute ideological devotion. Operating under the guise of a German officer, he extracted secrets from the mouths of drunken Wehrmacht officials in smoke-filled taverns and mess halls. According to later Soviet accounts, one of those officials, a mid-ranking intelligence officer, boasted about a grand plot underway, a German mission to eliminate the Allied leaders during their upcoming conference. The story had drama, detail, even a hint of drunken arrogance, but it contained one crucial flaw. The conference location was still a secret. If the Germans knew it, then the Allies had a leak at the highest levels. If they didn't know it, then the officers' comments were either speculation or propaganda. Nonetheless, the NKVD treated the claim as urgent. Kuznetsov's report, whether exaggerated or accurately relayed, became a seed in the fertile soil of Soviet suspicion. Around the same time, Soviet counterintelligence in Tehran intercepted strange radio signals at the edges of the city. They were faint, inconsistent, and difficult to decode. Some operators insisted they were nothing more than atmospheric interference. Others argued that they matched German transmission patterns, suggesting the presence of an illegal wireless cell. It was enough for the NKVD to act. They launched targeted searches, conducted interrogations, and quietly detained several individuals known to have past associations with German business and diplomatic ties. Whether these arrests yielded anything substantial remains unclear, but their existence helped build the official narrative. German agents had indeed slipped into Tehran. As the claimed evidence accumulated, the Soviets constructed a story that was both alarming and strangely convenient. They announced internally and then to the British and Americans that a team of German commandos had already infiltrated the city, led by operatives connected to Skorzeny. These agents, the NKVD said, were establishing safe houses, assembling explosives, and preparing for an assassination strike the moment the conference began. The Soviets declared they had neutralized some of the infiltrators, a claim for which no verifiable records have ever surfaced, while others, they insisted, were still at large. Stalin wasted no time using this intelligence to shape events. He informed the Western leaders that their original lodging plans were unsafe. Tehran, he implied, was riddled with German spies and local collaborators, and only the heavily guarded Soviet embassy offered true protection. Roosevelt, who had hoped to remain at the American legation to maintain independence and avoid the inevitable Soviet listening devices, found himself maneuvered into a corner. Unable to dismiss Stalin's warnings without appearing reckless, and perhaps genuinely wary of the threat, he agreed to stay under Soviet protection. The NKVD took this as both victory and responsibility. Soviet agents swarmed the city streets in plain clothes, posing as merchants, drivers, beggars, and clerks. Snipers were positioned on rooftops. Every road leading toward the embassies passed through layered checkpoints manned by soldiers with orders to stop anything that moved too quickly or too quietly. Tehran became a city under a microscope, and the Soviets held the lens. But here lies the paradox that still haunts the story. The Soviets never provided solid proof for the plot they claimed to have uncovered. Not during the conference, not after the war, not in the decades that followed. All the evidence derived from intelligence whispers, intercepted signals, reported sightings, and the testimony of partisans whose statements shifted across years of retelling. Historians later examining NKVD files found no documentation confirming the arrest of a German commando team. Nor did the Germans themselves, meticulous archivists even in defeat, leave behind any operational order or mission outline for an assassination attempt. Yet even without proof, the Soviets maintained the story because it served several purposes at once. It demonstrated their vigilance. It justified their heavy-handed security measures. It positioned Stalin as the protector of Allied unity, a political advantage he rarely passed up. And crucially, it brought Roosevelt physically into Stalin's orbit, giving the Soviet leader the proximity he needed to influence key decisions about the opening of a second front in Europe. Meanwhile, British intelligence reacted with skepticism. MI6 and the Special Operations Executive respected Soviet capabilities but distrusted their motives. They could not confirm the presence of German commandos. They had detected no increased Abwehr radio traffic and no signs of infiltration across the Caucasus or the Turkish frontier. To them, the Soviet warning felt suspiciously timed and politically convenient. But suspicion alone was not enough to override Stalin's insistence or Roosevelt's caution. In the end, the British bowed to the collective security arrangements, even as they privately wondered whether they were being played. Thus, as November 1943 gave way to December, the stage was set. 3 leaders, 1 city, and a threat that might have been real, imagined, or deliberately amplified. Tehran pulsed with tension. Every unexplained footstep sounded like an assassin's approach. Every shadow seemed sharper. And in the spaces between Soviet patrols and Allied convoys, the question lingered. If the Germans truly intended to strike, what form would their blow take? By the time the Big Three arrived in Tehran, the city had become a stage lit from every angle, yet no one could see the full picture. Each intelligence service, Soviet, British, American, operated with its own agenda, its own blind spot, and its own suspicions of the others. It was a city of masks, where no one spoke plainly, where every gesture could carry a double meaning. And it was into this environment that the alleged German infiltrators were said to have slipped, moving like ghosts through bazaars, embassy corridors, and crowded alleyways. The Soviets claimed that the first group of German agents had entered Iran months before the conference, disguised as merchants and tradesmen. They had supposedly embedded themselves into the labyrinthine streets of Tehran, where countless shops and stalls could conceal coded exchanges and covert meetings. Some NKVD officers described them as hardened commandos trained by Skorzeny. Others depicted them as local collaborators with German sympathies who acted as scouts and facilitators. The inconsistencies are telling. They suggest not a clear picture of enemy activity, but rather a narrative shaped to fit evolving political needs. Still, the tension inside the city felt real enough. British patrols noted unusual movement at night. American diplomatic staff reported that certain areas were abruptly declared off-limits by Soviet security without explanation. Even local Iranians sensed something had shifted. The atmosphere was heavier, the presence of foreign soldiers more intrusive. Tehran had always been a crossroads of intrigue, but now it felt like a city holding its breath. Within this tightening landscape, the figure of Otto Skorzeny hovered like a spectre. His daring rescue of Mussolini had shocked the world and elevated him to celebrity within the Nazi hierarchy. He had become the embodiment of German unconventional warfare. Bold, unpredictable, ruthless. Soviet claims that Skorzeny personally oversaw the training of the Tehran assassin team added a layer of credibility to the threat. If any German officer might attempt such a mission, it would be him. Yet Skorzeny himself later insisted the entire plot was fiction. According to his post-war testimony, he had never received orders for long jump, nor trained any operatives for an attack in Iran. Whether one believes his denial depends on how much trust can be placed in a man who thrived in the manipulation of perception. German radio traffic only deepened the ambiguity. Signals detected along Iran's northern frontier were inconsistent. Some analysts believed they belonged to German agents already inside Tehran. Others argued they originated from mobile transmitters across the border in occupied Soviet territory. A few experts went further, suggesting the signals were decoys. Deliberate noise meant to bait the Soviets into seeing threats that did not exist. If that was the intention, it succeeded brilliantly. Meanwhile, British and American intelligence officers, uneasy but not fully convinced by Soviet warnings, began conducting their own quiet assessments. MI6 operatives moved through Tehran's diplomatic enclaves, contacting informants, tracking suspicious foreigners, and digging through whatever remnants remained of the city's once active German community. They found traces: former businessmen who had vanished, abandoned networks, old safe houses long since compromised, but nothing that pointed to an operational assassination team. The OSS, still finding its footing as a young intelligence service, relied more on intuition and local contacts than on hard data. Their reports were cautious at best, skeptical at worst. They acknowledged the possibility of German agents in the city, but doubted the feasibility of a coordinated strike against all three Allied leaders under such heavy security. Yet if the Germans were not coming, why did the Soviets act as if they were already here? Why the sudden arrests? Why the radio intercept claims? Why the frantic rush to move Roosevelt into the Soviet embassy? Some historians believe the answer lies not in German action, but in Soviet strategy. Stalin understood the power of perception. By presenting himself as the guardian of Allied safety, he strengthened his position for the negotiations that lay ahead. The American president would depend on Soviet protection, physically and politically. The British Prime Minister would find himself marginalized, separated from Roosevelt in ways that carried subtle psychological weight. And here lies the heart of Tehran's shadow play. Whether long jump was real or not, it served a purpose. It created fear. It shaped logistics. It altered diplomatic dynamics. It moved Roosevelt closer to Stalin, both literally and figuratively, and pushed Churchill to the periphery. Soviet security agents celebrated their vigilance. German intelligence, hearing rumors of its own alleged operation, watched with fascination. And Tehran itself adjusted to the story like a living organism, tightening around the conference, as if bracing for an attack that might never come. Inside Tehran's bazaars, where spices mingled with cigarette smoke and conversations drifted in half-whispered Farsi, German agents may or may not have walked among the crowds. The NKVD insisted they had captured several. The Germans insisted no such agents had ever been sent. The truth remains locked behind the conflicting narratives of two states that preferred myth to transparency. But while stories tangled in the city streets, the most important events were unfolding behind embassy walls. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin carried the fate of millions in their briefcases. Their schedules shifted daily. Their routes were altered without warning, and every meeting was wrapped in layers of security shaped by the alleged German threat. The mere idea of long jump was enough to influence the choreography of diplomacy. In those days, Tehran was a city where the absence of evidence was not enough to calm fear. A city where every open window could be a vantage point, every delivery cart a disguise, every whisper a warning. It was a place where truth and deception walked side by side, indistinguishable in the dimming winter light. And beyond the walls of the Soviet embassy, beyond the guards, beyond the patrols, waited the question that no one could answer. If the Germans truly had a team inside Tehran, where were they hiding? And when would they strike? Roosevelt did not want to stay in the Soviet embassy. That detail often disappears beneath the mythology that later formed around the Tehran Conference, but it mattered deeply in the moment. He preferred the American legation, a modest compound where he could control his environment and rely on his own security. But the German assassination threat, as Stalin presented it, forced his hand. With practiced urgency, Stalin insisted the American legation was exposed, vulnerable, and riddled with blind spots that German agents could exploit. The Soviets had intercepted enemy communications, he claimed. They had tracked infiltrators moving toward the diplomatic quarter. They had arrested suspects, though none were ever shown to the Americans or British. In short, only the Soviet compound was safe. Roosevelt, physically fragile and politically cautious, made the uncomfortable choice. He allowed the Soviets to become his guardians. The move was unprecedented. Never before had a US president been housed under foreign protection during wartime negotiations. To the Soviets, this was a triumph. To the British, a troubling shift. To the Americans, a calculated risk. And to Stalin, it was an opportunity. One created and justified by the very story of Operation Long Jump. Once Roosevelt entered the Soviet embassy, the environment swallowed him. Every corridor, every staircase, every room seemed wrapped in a quiet, omnipresent vigilance. Guards moved with military precision. NKVD officers stood at their posts like statues carved from suspicion. Even the walls seemed to listen. American aides quickly realized that every conversation, no matter how trivial, echoed into Soviet ears. There was no privacy here. But the threat outside the compound, whether real or manufactured, made arguing against this surveillance impossible. Churchill reacted very differently. He distrusted Soviet intelligence, disliked Soviet hospitality, and loathed the idea that Roosevelt was now under Stalin's roof. Churchill believed diplomacy depended on proximity, and proximity now favored Stalin. The British Prime Minister lodged in the British Embassy just a few hundred yards away, close enough to walk but far enough to feel excluded. The Soviets assured him that the path between the embassies was secure, but Churchill still bristled. He saw, more clearly than anyone, the political metamorphosis underway. Roosevelt and Stalin were becoming a pair. Churchill had become the third man. This shift was not entirely accidental. The Soviets orchestrated the physical arrangement, shaping the psychological environment of the conference. Long Jump, the alleged German plot, had become the perfect lever. It allowed Stalin to appear protective, indispensable, even magnanimous. It allowed him to host the President of the United States within his own guarded stronghold. And it allowed the Soviets to control the flow of information, the layout of the meetings, and the subtle, interpersonal dynamics that would define the conference's outcomes. Inside the Soviet embassy, Roosevelt felt oddly liberated. Surrounded by Soviet security, insulated from American political pressures, he could focus on strategy. Stalin, with calculated charm, exploited this mood. He placed Roosevelt at ease. He flattered him. He hinted, gently, that Churchill's hesitations about a second front were rooted in old-world imperial caution, while America and the Soviet Union represented the future. Roosevelt, eager to carve his own path and unburdened by Churchill's wartime scars, leaned into this narrative. The two men laughed together, smoked together, traded subtle jabs at Churchill that only deepened the Prime Minister's unease. And all the while, the spectre of German assassins gave cover to this emerging alliance. But beneath the diplomatic theater, fear still seeped into the American delegation. Roosevelt's Secret Service detail was rattled. They studied every doorway, every balcony, every shadow inside the Soviet compound, searching for threats they could not name. The Soviets assured them the danger was outside, yet their behavior suggested the opposite. Why such intense interior security if the threat lay in Tehran's streets? Why were certain corridors off-limits? Why were Soviet guards stationed in places with no strategic relevance, unless one assumed the enemy was already inside the building? The Americans asked questions. The Soviets answered with firmness, but not clarity. Everything was under control, they repeated. Everything had been neutralized. Everything was safe, as long as the Americans followed Soviet protocols. For Roosevelt, the situation was tolerable. For his staff, it was suffocating. And then came the moment that hardened suspicions. A Soviet officer discreetly informed an American diplomat that another German radio operator had been captured only hours earlier. The details were vague, the location unclear, no identity provided, no equipment shown. Yet the message was unmistakable. The threat was ongoing, the Soviets were vigilant, and the Americans should trust no one but their hosts. It was a masterstroke of psychological engineering. Whether or not a German operator had actually been captured, the effect was identical. Anxiety deepened, dependence grew, and the story of Long Jump tightened its grip on the American imagination. Meanwhile, British intelligence watched the entire situation from an uneasy middle distance. MI6 officers studied Soviet movements, evaluated their claims, and quietly concluded that something did not add up. They had found no evidence of German infiltration. No surviving German operative was ever identified. No weapons caches were discovered. No intercepted transmissions could be authenticated. The British, cautious but experienced, suspected that the Soviets were inflating, perhaps even inventing, elements of the story. But Churchill, master strategist though he was, also knew the conference could not collapse into arguments over security theatrics. Diplomacy had to move forward. The German threat, real or not, had already shaped the terrain. Thus, the Soviet embassy became both sanctuary and trap, a place where the Americans found safety at the cost of autonomy, and the British found themselves watching their influence shrink. Tehran, once chosen as a neutral meeting ground, had transformed into a landscape sculpted entirely by Soviet control. The intelligence war behind the conference had become inseparable from the diplomacy within it, and somewhere outside those fortified walls, in the narrow alleys and smoky tea houses of Tehran, lingered one final haunting question. If the Germans never intended to strike, who benefited most from telling the world that they did, while Roosevelt and Stalin shared cigarettes and quiet calculations inside the Soviet embassy? The city beyond those thick walls continued its strange, suspended state. Tehran had become a mosaic of half-truths and shadows, each piece reflecting a different vision of the alleged German threat. The Soviets claimed infiltrators were scattered across the urban sprawl. The British insisted they could find no credible trace of them. The Americans navigated between those positions, uncertain whom to trust. And all the while, the legend of Operation Long Jump grew, even though the supposed operation itself remained strangely invisible. To understand the tension in the streets, one must picture Tehran not as the modern metropolis it later became, but as a sprawling patchwork of ancient bazaars, crumbling alleys, dusty courtyards, and modest homes pressed so close together that voices could drift across rooftops like desert wind. It was a city built for secrecy. Doors opened into hidden passages. Courtyards concealed private worlds. Merchants spoke in layered code. Not the code of spies, but the everyday evasiveness of a society accustomed to navigating power from many directions. If German agents had wanted to vanish into such a place, they could have. That much was true. But the key question, the question that has haunted historians ever since, is whether they actually did. Soviet patrols certainly acted as if they had. NKVD teams roamed the city with an intensity that startled the locals. They searched abandoned buildings, interrogated suspicious shopkeepers, and monitored every point of entry into the diplomatic district. They stopped carriages and searched their cargo. They pulled aside pedestrians whose clothing or accents suggested foreign origin. And each time they captured someone, a trader, a wanderer, a man sleeping rough near a caravan stop, they insisted he was linked to a German cell. But none of these arrests produced a verifiable German operative. No weapons were recovered that could be traced to German manufacture. No documents surfaced, no explosives, no rifles, no codes. Nothing that pointed definitively to an assassination mission. Still, the Soviets insisted the threat was ongoing, and in Tehran's suffocating atmosphere, insistence became a kind of truth. On the British side, the skepticism deepened. MI6 had access to signals intelligence from the region, as well as local networks developed during the earlier Anglo-Soviet occupation of Iran. Those networks had successfully dismantled the pre-war German presence in the country. By 1943, only a handful of Axis sympathizers remained, mostly low-level functionaries or stranded diplomats with no operational capability. To MI6, the idea of a sudden, well-organized German commando team slipping into the city undetected was improbable at best. Their field officers reported nothing that matched Soviet claims. But when they pressed the Soviets for details, the NKVD responded with a mixture of evasion and irritation, as if the British were questioning not intelligence, but loyalty. Meanwhile, the American OSS approached the situation with a kind of earnest confusion. Their presence in the Middle East was still relatively new. They lacked the deep networks the British had cultivated for decades. So the OSS did what young intelligence services often do. They watched, listened, and tried to appear wiser than they felt. They interviewed locals, traders, and minor officials. They followed rumors into tea houses and diplomatic backrooms. They tried to trace the supposed chain of German infiltrators. But every lead dissolved into hearsay. Every whisper contradicted the last. Every story looped back into the Soviet narrative. A narrative that could not be verified, yet refused to die. And then there were the Iranians themselves, who had their own view of the events. To them, the influx of foreign soldiers and spies was not new. Iran had long been a battleground for outside powers. But the intensity of Soviet paranoia startled them. Tehran's residents described checkpoints every few streets, armed patrols at every major intersection, and a sense of unease that spread through the bazaars like smoke. Some believed the Germans really were coming. Others believed the Soviets had created the story to justify their grip on the city. Most simply kept their heads down, aware that in times like these, even innocent men could be swept into the machinery of suspicion. Amid the uncertainty, a detail emerged that has puzzled researchers for decades. Just days before the conference, the Soviets reported killing 2 Germans attempting to flee across the desert toward Qom. The NKVD described them as radio operators, whose mission had been to coordinate German activities inside Tehran. But no bodies were shown to the Allies. No equipment was produced. No identities were provided. Even the location of the alleged confrontation shifted from report to report. If the event happened at all, it left no trace. If it did not, it served its purpose anyway, reinforcing the story that Soviet vigilance was all that stood between the Allies and catastrophe. Back in the German archives, what survived them? The silence is equally striking. Not a single authenticated document references a mission resembling long jump. No operational orders, no personnel lists, no training memos, no transport records, no allocation of equipment, no transmission logs, nothing. For an intelligence service as bureaucratically meticulous as the SS, and for a commando leader as self-promoting as Skorzeny. This absence is deafening. And yet, the idea remains stubbornly difficult to dismiss entirely. Could a small number of German agents have acted independently, pursuing a desperate initiative without formal authorization? Could Berlin have explored such a plan in vague theoretical terms, leaving no paper trail, then abandoned it before execution? Could the Russians have misinterpreted isolated German communications, building a narrative around fragments? Each possibility is plausible, but none provides certainty. What we are left with is a phenomenon that occurs often in wartime intelligence, the ghost operation. A mission that may have existed or may have been imagined, but whose impact was real because people believed it might be real. The Allies adjusted their movements. The Soviets tightened their grip. Roosevelt changed lodgings. The diplomatic choreography shifted, and the legend of long jump grew legs, walking independently of its factual roots, or lack thereof. In Tehran's streets, German agents may have been hunted. They may have been entirely invented. They may have been nothing more than shadows cast by anxious minds. But the result was the same. The city remained on edge. The Soviets remained in control. And the real drama, the diplomacy inside the embassies, unfolded under the long shadow of a threat no one could fully prove. What mattered next was not whether the Germans would strike, but how the shifting balance of trust and manipulation inside those walls would shape the decisions that determined the rest of the war. Inside the thick-walled fortress of the Soviet embassy, where every word seemed to echo into unseen ears, the great powers finally sat down together. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, three men who governed not only nations but narratives, now found themselves operating in a space shaped by fear, diplomacy, and the unseen influence of an alleged assassination plot. Whether Operation Long Jump existed in reality or only in suggestion, its presence shaped everything that followed. For Roosevelt, the mood was paradoxical. He felt unusually light, almost free, in a way that startled even those closest to him. Removed from Washington's political pressures and cocooned inside Soviet security, he conducted himself with an ease that contrasted sharply with Churchill's storm cloud intensity. Roosevelt preferred informal conversation, personal charm, and the soft influence of shared understanding. And under Stalin's roof, he felt positioned exactly where he wanted to be, at the center of diplomatic attention, insulated from the exhausting rituals that normally governed such meetings. But this insulation came with a cost, one Roosevelt sensed only faintly. He was no longer controlling the environment. He was operating inside Stalin's environment. Stalin understood this dynamic perfectly. His behavior during the Tehran Conference was a masterclass in emotional strategy, alternating between warmth, gravity, irony, and carefully measured silence. He knew Roosevelt admired decisive leadership. He knew the American president's relationship with Churchill, though friendly, strained under the weight of competing visions. And he knew that appearing as Roosevelt's natural ally, the one who offered protection, the one who had saved him from a German plot, would tilt the conference in his favor. The alleged assassination threat amplified every advantage Stalin possessed. It made him the protector, the host, the man whose intelligence service kept danger at bay. And when a man protects you, it becomes easier to trust him, even if you cannot fully explain why. Churchill saw this happening and felt the shift acutely. Of the three leaders, he alone viewed Tehran not as neutral ground, but as hostile terrain. His instincts told him the Soviets were using long jump for political leverage. The British Prime Minister, already under enormous strain managing a war that was bleeding his country dry, found himself outmaneuvered before the negotiations even began. Roosevelt and Stalin seemed relaxed. Churchill felt cornered. This tension played out in the earlier sessions. When the topic of the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe arose, Stalin pressed with relentless clarity. He wanted a firm date for what would become Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France. He had been demanding this for years, and now, seated across from a Roosevelt increasingly sympathetic to him, Stalin seized the moment. The German threat looming outside the embassy's walls became a psychological backdrop that emphasized urgency. If the Germans were willing to kill Allied leaders, then surely the Allies must strike back with equally decisive coordination. Roosevelt agreed in principle. Churchill hesitated. British forces were stretched thin across the Mediterranean. The lessons of Gallipoli still haunted him. But in Tehran, Churchill's caution clashed with Roosevelt's optimism and Stalin's iron insistence. The shifting gravity pulled the decision forward. The Second Front would open in 1944. In effect, the most consequential military operation of the modern world, D-Day, was hardened into reality in a room shaped by suspicion, fear, and Soviet control. It is an unsettling truth that one of the greatest turning points of World War II may have been influenced, at least indirectly, by a phantom threat. This dynamic extended into discussions of post-war Europe. Stalin outlined his expectations with the calm confidence of a man who understood he held the winning hand. He wanted Poland shifted west. He wanted the Baltic states secured. He wanted influence over Eastern Europe. Though Roosevelt resisted some of these ambitions, the power balance at Tehran was not evenly distributed. Stalin's position rested on military dominance on the Eastern Front, and politically, on the leverage created by the long jump narrative. Churchill tried to counterbalance Stalin's demands with eloquence, strategic arguments, even humor. But Roosevelt, influenced by both personal philosophy and the practical need to maintain Soviet cooperation, often leaned toward finding common ground with Stalin rather than reinforcing British reservations. And beneath all this, the lingering threat of a German assassination attempt created a subtle psychological bond between Roosevelt and Stalin. A shared narrative of danger survived together. If the Germans truly intended to strike, the two men had united against a common threat. If the Germans never intended to strike, Stalin had engineered one of the most effective psychological environments in diplomatic history. Either way, Churchill was the odd man out. There was a moment, small, almost theatrical, that captured the dynamic. During one meeting, Stalin made a joke at Churchill's expense. It was sharp, pointed, and delivered with a grin. Roosevelt laughed. Churchill forced a polite smile. It was a tiny moment, but it symbolized a larger pattern. Churchill, who had carried Britain through its darkest hours, now found himself fighting for influence at a table where alliances were shifting faster than military fronts. Outside the embassy, Soviet patrols intensified. NKVD officers reported that 2 more suspicious individuals had been detained. Again, no names. Again, no evidence presented. But the reports served their purpose. They kept the story alive. They maintained the atmosphere. They reminded everyone, especially the Americans, that danger lurked just beyond the conference walls. Long jump had become more than a threat. It had become a psychological tool. Yet inside that charged environment, the Big Three made decisions that shaped the collapse of the Third Reich, the boundaries of post-war Europe, and the geopolitical order that would define the next half-century. They discussed Germany's partition, the future United Nations, the continuation of the war in the Pacific. Every topic was affected, at least subtly, by the human emotions inside the room. Emotions bent and refracted by fear, mistrust, and manipulation. The most remarkable irony is that amid all these historic decisions, no German assassin ever appeared. No shot was fired. No bomb detonated. No commando breached the walls of the Soviet embassy. The only danger that leaders faced came from the shifting alliances within the room, not from infiltrators in the streets. Still, the question that would echo through history remained. Did Stalin truly believe a German attack was imminent? Or did he merely understand the advantage of claiming one? The answer would become clearer and more complicated. In the days that followed, when the conference ended, the delegates departed, and Operation Long Jump drifted from urgent intelligence warning into haunting legend. The Tehran Conference ended the way many great political dramas do, quietly, with handshakes, formal photographs, and politely spoken farewells masking the undercurrents that had shaped every hour of negotiation. Roosevelt departed satisfied, feeling he had built a meaningful rapport with Stalin and secured clarity on the Second Front. Churchill left weary, aware he had been pushed to the margins and uneasy about Stalin's rising influence. Stalin, calm and watchful as ever, left having achieved nearly everything he wanted, not through force, but through environment, narrative, and psychological command. And outside the embassy walls, Tehran simply exhaled. The checkpoints loosened, the patrols thinned. The bizarre voices rose once more, less fearful, more alive. The Germans, if they were ever there at all, faded back into the realm of rumor. But the story of Operation Long Jump did not end in Tehran. In many ways, it began there. As the delegations returned to their respective capitals, a new question followed them like a shadow. If the Germans had intended to kill the Big Three, why had the attempt failed so quietly? Where were the captured agents? Why were details so scarce? And why, above all, had the Soviets been so effective at shaping the narrative while providing so little evidence? The Americans accepted the story largely as told. Roosevelt's time under Soviet protection had created a sense of gratitude, even admiration, for Stalin's apparent vigilance. The Secret Service filed reports acknowledging the risk and praising the NKVD's countermeasures. The OSSS, despite its internal doubts, allowed the narrative to stand. It was easier in the fog of war to embrace a dramatic story than to challenge the intelligence of an ally whose cooperation was essential for victory. The British were less convinced. MI6 officers compiled assessments noting their inability to corroborate Soviet claims. Churchill's wartime intelligence chief, Sir Stuart Menzies, quietly suspected exaggeration. The British had long experience with Soviet disinformation tactics, and Tehran had shown classic signs: inconsistent details, conveniently timed discoveries, and political gains flowing neatly toward the storyteller. Yet even skepticism has limits during wartime. The British could not publicly dispute their ally without fracturing the coalition, so the doubts remained in classified files, tucked away behind steel drawers and locked cabinets. The truth, or at least the closest thing to truth, emerged only in fragments in the years and decades that followed. German officers captured after the war denied the existence of Long Jump emphatically. High-ranking figures in the Abwehr, RSHA, and SS insisted no such mission had ever been planned. Otto Skorzeny, the man most often associated with the operation, went further. He mocked the idea, calling it a Soviet fantasy. Yet Skorzeny's career thrived on myth-making. He played with truth the way a Lardar stage magician plays with light. And historians have long questioned whether his denial was political, performative, or merely convenient. None of the German archives examined after the war contained operational orders or references to a Tehran plot. No budget allocations, no transport logs, no command briefings, nothing. It was absence, not evidence, that began to tell the story. And yet, there were oddities difficult to dismiss. The Germans did attempt sporadic, small-scale intelligence actions in the Middle East during this period. They maintained contacts with anti-Allied groups. They explored sabotage and infiltration routes across the Caucasus. They discussed, at least in theory, high-value assassination strikes. And some wartime intercepts suggested that Berlin had indeed speculated about disrupting the conference. But speculation is not a plan, and a plan is not an operation. Meanwhile, the Soviets doubled down. In official histories published during the decades of Stalin's rule and long after, Long Jump was presented as a heroic counterintelligence victory. Soviet films, books, and propaganda depicted daring NKVD agents uncovering a deadly German commando team at the last second. The story grew with retelling, details solidified, villains gained names, arrests became dramatic gunfights. An operation that likely never progressed beyond Berlin's anxious imagination became, in the Soviet telling, a triumph of socialist vigilance against fascist treachery. It was a perfect propaganda tool, dramatic, patriotic, morally clear, and it painted the Soviet Union not only as a military savior, but as an indispensable shield protecting the global alliance. No proof was needed. The narrative served its purpose. But reality was more complicated. Some historians believe the Soviets genuinely misunderstood German intelligence chatter and, in the fog of war, misinterpreted signals that pointed to reconnaissance rather than assassination. Others argue Stalin used the threat deliberately, not to deceive the Allies about German intentions, but to manipulate the emotional terrain of the conference. And then there is the third possibility, the one that lingers like a faint echo in the intelligence community, that the Germans may have explored a preliminary idea for such an operation, informal and embryonic, which the Soviets interpreted as imminent danger. In that scenario, Operation Long Jump could be described not as fiction, but as a ghost of a plan, a shadow, a whisper that left no footprint, a possibility that never grew large enough to cast a full outline, yet large enough for Stalin to weaponize. Even in the post-war years, when most of the major players were gone and archives slowly opened, the mystery refused to settle. Soviet files revealed no captured infiltrators, no mission logs, no interrogation reports, nothing but the same old references, rumored agents, intercepted fragments, unnamed operatives. Still, the story endured. Because in a sense, it did not matter whether Operation Long Jump happened. What mattered was that it worked. It kept Roosevelt under Soviet watch. It sidelined British influence. It strengthened Stalin's bargaining position. And it allowed the Soviet Union to claim a heroic intelligence victory for generations. In diplomacy, as in espionage, perception often becomes reality. Operation Long Jump may have been the most consequential, non-existent operation of the war, a threat that never materialized but shaped decisions that altered history. The final truth of Tehran lies somewhere between manipulation and misinterpretation, between fear and strategy, between the shadows cast by men and the shadows cast by their ambitions. And one final chapter remains, not in Tehran, not in Berlin, but in the long trail of myths, memoirs, and revelations that followed, each pulling the story in a slightly different direction. History has a strange habit of amplifying the stories that were never fully proven. When an operation leaves no bodies, no weapons, no orders, and no confessions, one might expect it to fade quietly into the margins of archival footnotes. But Operation Long Jump did the opposite. It grew, it evolved, it gathered weight and detail, not from evidence, but from retelling. What the war did not confirm, the post-war world supplied with imagination, ideology, and cinematic flair. The myth-making began early, even before the dust of war had settled. Soviet historians launched the first wave, crafting the official narrative with the confidence of victors. They presented the NKVD not as an intelligence service prone to paranoia and political manipulation, but as a fortress of omniscience that had single-handedly prevented a catastrophic German strike. In Soviet retellings, the alleged German operatives gained names, faces, elaborate backstories. The plot, once a vague whisper, hardened into a full-fledged assassination scheme executed by elite commandos. Dramatic chases materialized. Gunfights emerged. Soviet agents performed feats of bravery that no wartime document had ever recorded. For the USSR, Long Jump was not just a story. It was a political tool. A reminder to its own citizens and the world that the Soviet state had been the shield protecting global civilization from fascist destruction. The story affirmed Stalin's leadership. It framed the NKVD as indispensable. It fit seamlessly into a larger narrative of vigilance, sacrifice, and triumph. And it allowed the Soviet Union to claim a unique moral victory at Tehran, one the West could not easily dispute without challenging the legitimacy of wartime cooperation. On the German side, a different kind of myth-making took shape. Otto Skorzeny, never one to ignore an opportunity to burnish his legend, danced around the story with theatrical ambiguity. In some interviews, he denied the operation with dismissive certainty. In others, he hinted that the Germans had considered such a mission, only to abandon it due to impracticality. And in the post-war environment, where ex-SS officers often inflated their wartime exploits to maintain a sense of relevance, the idea of Skorzeny leading a daring assassination plot against the Big Three became too irresistible for some writers to let go. But no two versions of the German side of the story ever matched. Some claimed the agents entered Iran through Turkey. Others suggested they parachuted into the north. Still others spoke of a special operations team trained in Austria, deployed quietly, then intercepted before reaching Tehran. None of these accounts were corroborated. All of them contradicted each other. The inconsistencies themselves became part of the legend. The idea that the operation was so secret, so compartmentalized, that even after the war, its details remained shrouded. But intelligence professionals know that real operations, no matter how secret, leave some trace. Long Jump left none. Meanwhile, in the West, the story gained momentum in an entirely different form: popular culture. Throughout the Cold War, filmmakers and novelists found in Long Jump a perfect dramatic template, a secret Nazi plot foiled by daring Soviet agents, with the survival of the Allied war effort hanging in the balance. These stories echoed the old propaganda, but infused it with Cold War logic. By retelling the tale, Western audiences could marvel at the heroism of wartime unity, while avoiding the uncomfortable fact that the Soviets had manipulated the conference environment to their advantage. It allowed a clean, thrilling narrative to replace the more complex truth. The deeper irony is that when Western historians finally gained access to some Soviet archives after the fall of the USSR, the files contained less evidence for Long Jump than anyone expected. No details, no reports, no captured agents, no interrogation transcripts, only references, vague, unanchored, and unverifiable, connecting the supposed plot to the partisan intelligence of Kuznetsov, who, although brilliant, often received information second-hand through inebriated German officers whose drunken boasts may have been little more than bravado. Yet by that point, the legend had already become too large to dismantle. Too many articles had been written, too many documentaries produced, too many stories told around dinner tables by veterans and intelligence officers who were certain the plot had existed because it felt like it should have existed. It made narrative sense. It added danger to a conference already filled with tension. It explained Roosevelt's relocation. It justified Soviet precautions. It gave dramatic color to a pivotal moment in world history. But legends grow not because they are true, but because they fill a space that truth alone cannot satisfy. Long Jump filled the space between fear and politics, paranoia and strategy, wartime necessity and post-war storytelling. It became a symbol, not of what happened, but of what might have happened, and of how leaders behave when confronted with threats they cannot see clearly. In the intelligence world, the most powerful operations are often the ones that never take place. They shape decisions, alter behavior, and manipulate perception without ever needing to be executed. And so, in that sense, Operation Long Jump was an extraordinary success, not for Germany, but for the Soviet Union. It gave Stalin leverage. It reframed Tehran's atmosphere. It positioned the Soviets as protectors and hosts, and it crafted a legacy of vigilance that endured long after the war's final guns fell silent. Perhaps the greatest paradox is this: a mission that likely never progressed beyond anxious German speculation and opportunistic Soviet exaggeration left one of the largest fingerprints on the diplomatic stage of World War II. The myth outlived the men. The story outlived the evidence. And Operation Long Jump passed into history not as a failed German operation, but as a testament to the power of fear, rumor, and narrative in shaping the fate of nations. And yet, the story still is not finished. One final chapter remains: a reckoning with what historians, intelligence officers, and political leaders eventually concluded about Long Jump, and how this ghost operation continues to influence the way we understand wartime truth even now. In the decades that followed World War II, as archives opened, as memoirs were written, as governments declassified forgotten files, Operation Long Jump lingered like a ghost in the intelligence corridors of 3 continents. It refused to vanish, not because new evidence emerged, but because the operation had become something larger than fact. It had become a test of how nations remember, how intelligence services mythologize their own deeds, and how the world interprets events shaped as much by psychology as by strategy. When Western historians re-examined Tehran with the cool distance of time, they found themselves drifting toward one unavoidable conclusion. If Long Jump had existed as described by the Soviets, it should have been visible somewhere in German records. German intelligence operations were often chaotic, divided, and plagued by rivalries, but they were not formless. They produced paperwork. They produced codes. They produced logs, schedules, personnel files. Yet for Long Jump, there was nothing but air. This absence hardened skepticism into near certainty. The Germans did not mount an assassination mission against the Big Three in Tehran. That would seem to close the case, but not entirely. Intelligence veterans warned that the absence of evidence was not always the evidence of absence. Some covert plans were designed with minimal documentation, especially those considered too risky or too improbable to commit to official channels. And so, the question persisted: could Long Jump have existed in preliminary, unwritten form? The answer lies buried in the psychology of wartime intelligence. German agencies explored hundreds of theoretical operations that never materialized. Some were discarded within days. Some were abandoned when feasibility collapsed. Some were reduced to rumor inside the Reich itself. Tehran may have been one of these. An idea whispered, explored, loosely considered, but never officially born. Yet what elevates Long Jump beyond mere rumor is not German behavior, but Soviet behavior. The Soviets treated the threat as real. They mobilized resources. They altered diplomatic arrangements. They used the story to reshape the conference environment. They immortalized the threat in propaganda for generations. To dismiss Long Jump entirely would mean arguing that Stalin's intelligence machine engineered an elaborate fiction out of nothing, a possibility many historians accept, but one that carries its own troubling implications. Because if the Soviets exaggerated or invented the plot, then Tehran becomes something more unsettling, an early display of the political theater that would characterize Soviet influence throughout the Cold War. A demonstration of how fear, when wielded skillfully, becomes a diplomatic weapon as sharp as any blade. But the story becomes even more nuanced when viewed through the lens of Soviet inner politics. The NKVD thrived on proving its indispensability. Every threat they uncovered, real or imagined, justified their power. Tehran offered them a stage. It allowed Soviet intelligence to present itself as superior to the bumbling Abwehr, as vigilant guardians of global Allied leadership, and as the invisible hand that prevented catastrophe. Even Stalin, famously distrustful of all his institutions, understood the propaganda value. Meanwhile, British historians, often the sharpest critics of Soviet wartime narratives, came to describe Long Jump as a Soviet political instrument rather than a German operational reality. American scholars were more diplomatic, calling it an unconfirmed threat that shaped confirmed decisions. Even within Russia today, where Soviet narratives have been revisited with sometimes surprising honesty, long jump remains a subject of debate, a story caught between pride and skepticism. One of the most revealing details came from a former NKVD officer interviewed in the 1960s. When asked directly about long jump, he replied with a smile that captured the entire enigma. "We believed it because it was useful to believe it." That sentence may be the closest we will ever come to a confession. But the enduring power of Operation Long Jump does not rest on whether German commandos crept through Tehran's alleys, or whether Skorzeny trained a secret assassination squad. Its power rests on something deeper, something timeless, because Long Jump is a window into the machinery of fear. It shows how leaders behave when the air around them thickens with uncertainty, how intelligence services shape reality, how a whisper becomes a weapon, and how, in war, the shadow of an idea can be more influential than the idea itself. And so, historians today tend to summarize Long Jump with a paradoxical truth. The operation almost certainly never happened, but its impact absolutely did. It repositioned Roosevelt, it isolated Churchill, it empowered Stalin, it influenced the decision to launch D-Day in 1944. It gave the Soviet Union a heroic narrative that lasted half a century, and it left us with a question that refuses to die. Because in the end, the answer illuminates something far larger than Tehran. It reveals the fragile architecture of trust, fear, and manipulation upon which the great decisions of history are built. As long as intelligence agencies exist, as long as political leaders navigate threats seen and unseen, as long as war breeds uncertainty and rumor, Operation Long Jump will remain relevant. It is a reminder that the world is often guided not by what is real, but by what is believed to be real. And Tehran, for one fragile week in 1943, became the place where belief shaped history more powerfully than bullets ever could. If this deep dive into the shadows of World War II left you questioning what was real, what was myth, and what was deliberately engineered, then you've just experienced the core of what WW2 Declassified is all about. Stories like Operation Long Jump force us to look past the official narratives and into the hidden machinery of fear, power, and intelligence that shaped the outcome of the war, and still shapes our world today. So if you want more untold history, more secret operations, more declassified mysteries the textbooks never had room for, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who loves digging into the darker corners of WW2. And most importantly, comment below. Do you think Operation Long Jump was a real German threat or a Soviet manipulation? Your thoughts might shape the next episode.